Welcome to the Philanthropy Masterminds podcast, brought to you by DonorSearch, the show that takes you inside the lives of thought leaders, innovators, and change makers in fundraising, philanthropy, and civil society. I'm your host, Jay Frost. Krista Slade is an international leader whose epic voyage from Toronto to Hong Kong, Melbourne, Singapore, Oxford, and back again has had a major and lasting impact on the size, shape, and scope of advancement programs around the world. In today's episode, we take that journey with her, learning about each of these unique environments, the challenges and the successes, and the enduring characteristic which continues to fuel her optimism for the work we do in fundraising and philanthropy.
I'm going to guess I'm your first ever guest joining you from St. John's Within, which is within the harbor of Trinity Bay in Newfoundland on the far east coast, far north in the North Atlantic. And it's a really beautiful little spot, fishing community. And it's a beautiful, beautiful part of the world, but pretty remote.
How did you find yourself there?
This is my family's cottage/cabin. You have to be careful if you say cottage, sounds a bit pretentious in Newfoundland, so everyone says cabin. So this is our family. It's just a lovely spot that we've had in our family for a number of years, and it's a lovely place to be. I'm normally based in Toronto, though, right in the downtown heart of the city. So this is a real change for me.
But
my normal habitat.
Have you been going back there for a long time? I mean, is this a childhood place or?
No, not as long as that. But I've certainly been coming back to Newfoundland since my childhood. I mean, I was, raised in Toronto and certainly consider myself from Toronto, but my family on both sides, going back many, many generations, are Newfoundland. So many of my family members are still here. So
how far back?
I'm actually to the early 1700s, which is kind of amazing on both sides of my family. Newfoundland was the first part of North America that was settled by the English. And some people may know that the Vikings were here hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And it was the first overseas colony that Great Britain had. So my ancestors were fishermen on one side, and they settled here and somehow made a go of it. It's a pretty tough place to live. It's a pretty rugged and harsh landscape, but it's a wonderful part of the country. And I feel very, very grounded when I come back here because of that long familial history. And also they were great seafarers. So even though they lived here, they often went all over the world, trying to, support their families through fishing and transporting goods and materials. I had a great-grandfather who died 100 years ago this year in Seville, and he's buried in Seville, and he was a great navigator who went all over the world. And now with all these amazing genealogical digital resources, have tracked down amazing things about, adventures he had going to South America and to all over like Portugal, Spain, Italy, down to the Caribbean. Anyway, so all to say, I come from a family of wanderers. So you won't be surprised that I've worked outside of Canada a lot of my career. I kind of come by it honestly. So
yeah, I was going to say, I mean, even if you're grounded in a place like Toronto and their deep roots, you've spent a lot of your life running around the world. And that's where we first met was through that work. In fact, I can't even think back when it first was, but I know that you were with the University of Toronto early in your career, and the office there was already pretty profound in its links to the rest of the world. And I know you can tell us about that, but when did you first join them? I mean, how did that come about, and how did you find your way into this world of development that we're in?
Well, spoiler alert, Jay, I didn't grow up wanting to be a fundraiser. I'm sure that's the case with virtually every person that you talk to. It wasn't any kind of a career that I would have identified. But like many of your guests and many of our colleagues, I kind of got involved happily as a student leader. I was, quite involved with the student government and had a job working as an alumni relations assistant for the office in Toronto. And I had a great experience doing that, really enjoyed working working for the university in that role, and had the great fortune of being chosen by the Rotary Foundation. So if there's any Rotarians that are listening, I want to thank Rotary International and the Rotary Foundation, because they gave me a scholarship to go and study in Hong Kong. And I set off in 1992 to do a program in Hong Kong at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. It was called the Yale and China program. It was sort of administered by that university in New Haven and the Chinese University of Hong Kong. But it was through this Rotary scholarship and this, great benefaction that I had the chance to go. And my manager, when I was working in the alumni relations office, said, "Oh, you're going to Hong Kong. We have so many graduates there, and we'd love to do a better job of keeping in touch with them." And this is all pre-email, this is still things being sent out by fax and by post and by the phone. So she basically offered me the opportunity to work 1 day a week as an alumni relations assistant for the association in Hong Kong. And I jumped at the chance, really more to meet people and to, make the most of my year while I was there, because I didn't know a soul in Hong Kong when I set off. And that introduced me to an incredible community of supporters. And I just met amazing people and realized there was a lot of potential there, building on this strong, alumni community to actually raise money for scholarships and other things at the university. And so as timing is everything. So I was kind of there on the ground. I think most of the alumni in Hong Kong were kind of trying to figure out who is this woman from Toronto who's come out and is organizing us and getting us together. And they were very supportive, as I said, very friendly, very welcoming. And I kind of created my first job. So I finished my program of study and basically created a full-time job for myself, setting up this foundation office in Hong Kong. And it was amazing. So that's how I got into it. Not by design.
I think I went to a conference many years ago, and John Delandre was describing the foundation of this office. How this all started. And so now in my mind, it's this kind of fog, but I seem to remember this whole story about 1 day a week, then turning into several days a week, turning into a full-time operation, and this whole 10-year plan. And you were in the heart of that. So how much of that really was a plan and how much of it was organic growth?
It's never, of course, entirely one thing or the other. But I mean, I had the good fortune to be there at the right time. It was, the lead up to the handover in 1997. A lot of people that had ties to Toronto, ties to Canada, who were, looking to be philanthropic. The university was starting this big campaign, the kind of Great Minds for a Great Future. And under John's leadership and Ravi Frankel's leadership, they gave me incredible opportunity. So it scaled up from very modest beginnings. I mean, literally, I was working off the side of half a desk over top a jewelry store, in central Hong Kong that was owned by our alumni association president, whose family owned the business and owned a lot of other things in Hong Kong and Macau. This is the Stanley Ho's family, who were at that time, of course, and to this day have been incredibly generous supporters of higher education. So, it started off, I think we did a lot of things by trial and error just to kind of see how things might work. But it folded in so neatly with the university's campaign and that emphasis on internationalization. I think U of T was very much a pioneer in doing that and really wanting to be strategic about how it was regularly involving graduates and parents and new students, and not just going off opportunistically once a year, having me on the ground and eventually I had an additional colleague and, at one point we were up to 3 people, but, we were there throughout the year and really building, I think, a comprehensive advancement operation, which included student recruitment, which was great because we got to meet a lot of, incoming students, got to meet a lot of the parents, but also, of course, a big emphasis on the major gifts program to support the scholarships, which got basically set up in 1995. And, it's just been remarkable to see how those young people who we supported all those years ago have flourished and are now involved in the foundation. So it's that wonderful kind of virtuous circle. But
right.
The short version is I really genuinely think it happened with a combination of just timing and sort of serendipitous circumstances, but also very much the investment from the university that they wanted to engage with their international alumni, and that, Hong Kong, for all kinds of reasons, was a great place to do that.
It seems like it was rare then, probably to some degree rare today as well. But also the timing of that was so exceptional because, as you say, it was working up towards 97. And for those who don't understand that time, can you describe what that was like to work in Hong Kong right before the transition?
Wow. Well, it was quite a remarkable period. And I mean, I had studied history as a student, so it was fascinating to be there to kind of see really the end of empire for the British in Asia, because they were, of course, stepping back. And it was actually quite nostalgic to kind of see like Chris Patton, who was the last governor of Hong Kong, and they were winding up while, of course, the Chinese repatriation and kind of reunification with the homeland, with the mainland. So there was this mix of, nostalgia, I think, for what had been over the last, 150 plus years of British, colonization. I think at that time, there was a great deal of enthusiasm, patriotism, a sense of real history that things were going back to China, and that this was the right time, and that it may not be exactly clear how it was going to actually work out. But I think people had good faith that, it was going to be a very exciting chapter for Hong Kong. And it was also a period where there was enormous investment in all kinds of the new airport was just being built, massive infrastructure, the MRT, which is the mass rapid transit, like this incredible subway system, was expanding. They were building new social housing. It was a real period of expansion and optimism, and tinged with that bit of nostalgia for the kind of winding down of the British Empire. And I just an absolutely fascinating place to be. And, when people found out you were from Canada, there was a great affinity, because at that time, I think there were about 150,000 Canadian passport holders or Canadian citizens who lived in Hong Kong. So you'd meet people all over the place who had a connection back to Canada. Actually facilitated a lot of those relationships. It was just, again, right place, right time. But it was a very, very just dynamic, there were a number of things that happened, like the Asian financial crisis. There was the avian flu pandemic. That I was there. I was actually living more in Singapore at the time when SARS broke out. So, we kind of were living through some pretty interesting times. And of course, it's been interesting to see how it's unfolded since the 1997 handover. But at that time, it was certainly one of great optimism, and it was just a really dynamic place to be. And, Hong Kong has always been such an international, open city with, people from all over the world kind of coming to make their fortune. And so it's just been fascinating to kind of see the last few years how things have changed and continue to be pretty challenging there. But it was at that time, it was a golden period to be in Hong Kong. And I'm just, so grateful I was there when I was. And I will always love Hong Kong. It'll always be one of my absolutely favorite cities in the world. It's an amazing place.
Now, you were there until around 2002, is that right? Or
yes, I was there for about 10 years. And then I actually moved to Melbourne. I was working in Australia, so I kind of moved even further away from Toronto. But that was kind of to cover more of a regional role for the university based out of Australia. And also too, just the pollution was becoming more and more problematic for me living in Hong Kong. So I had developed really serious asthma as a result of living there. So for health reasons, I just couldn't continue to live there full time. So that's part of what prompted my move. But
sure. I'm trying to think about the pollution in Hong Kong, because in the rest of China, it can be pretty extraordinary. Yeah. And that's just a facet of that huge economic growth, I guess, all those coal-fired plants and everything else. But it was also that time when so much wealth, and still today, it was and is being created as a result of all this. But it's led to a lot of other issues. And I suppose that's also been opportunities in a way for philanthropy, for people to look not just outside. How do we work with the places we went to school and the other things we care about abroad, but also inside the country? Were you already sensing some of that about kind of this looking inward, not in a way to address some of these interests and needs?
Sure. I mean, I would say, Jay, you've kind of hit the nail on the head that, the say high net worth, very successful people that we got to know through the foundation, they were really driven, I think, by two things, I'd say. Primarily, supporting education, I think, is just such a part of the Confucian social norms, or it's very much ingrained in their philanthropic culture to support education. And so that was obviously a very good thing. And I think secondly, the people that I had the privilege to work with, they were very much, I think, wanting to invest in young people who wouldn't have had the chance to study. That was very much, I think, at the core of our success, just giving that sort of opportunity to those students. And there was a matching campaign that was available from the university at the time. There were also a number of large principal gifts and major gifts that came in that were tied to supporting research at the university that would benefit, Hong Kong and the kind of the relationship between Canada and East Asia. So, for example, there was a new program that was launched in Asia Pacific Studies that was funded by one of our benefactors. And again, that wouldn't have been possible if we didn't have that kind of leadership from the donors based in Hong Kong. So I think it really was a mutually beneficial relationship, and that the university was able to attract amazing students who just didn't have the financial resources to come. And it also allowed us to engage in a lot more research and, scholarship about that part of the world, which is, of course, so important to Canada and to Canadians to know more, given how much immigration is, enriching our society.
There used to be these discussions long ago about what was the Pacific Rim and how far people, where people would draw those geographic lines. And clearly Canada made this kind of decision. I don't know if that was a governmental decision or that on the part of educational institutions or transnationals who just saw Canada as a friendly place to do work and business and spend part of their time, if not to emigrate, that Canada was a part of the Pacific Rim in ways the United States maybe was not, with the exception of California, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that Canada actually was, particularly on the immigration front, was very wise to really, invest heavily in their immigration program to attract talented immigrants, particularly from China and Hong Kong and Taiwan and, the kind of East Asia and also South Asia through their, it's a very good program in Canada, which is based around, kind of talent and attracting capital and gives a little more flexibility for people when they choose to immigrate. If you can be declared a non-residency and not be liable for worldwide income tax the way American passport holders are. So, there were some very smart decisions that were made because Canada needs more people and obviously needs, talent and capital. So I think it's all been for the good.
Now, then you went on to Melbourne, and pollution aside and all that, boy, what a switch that must have been. So how was it to be there, and how was the work different as well? Both the life for you, but also the work in philanthropy.
Well, Melbourne was, I have to say, and continues to be, just a highlight of my working career that I had the chance to live there for a few years. And partly that's because when I was a kid, I was absolutely obsessed with Australia. I was completely loved Australia and, was just, did all kinds of geography projects on Australia. So it was a real dream of mine to actually get there, and to have the chance to work there was really kind of a life highlight. And Australia and Canada have, of course, quite a few things in common in terms of their history and, the big commodity agriculture, resource, immigrant societies, big countries with not a huge amount of arable land. So there's a lot of similarities there. And I found Australians to be incredibly welcoming, and, they have a great quality of life, and they have a great approach to life in many respects. I have to say, I think that the Canadian experience that I had working at University of Toronto in the role that I took up at the University of Melbourne, where I was working basically as a strategic advisor to the president of the university, the vice chancellor of the University of Melbourne. It was actually really helpful, I think, to be able to look at what had worked at Toronto and to say, well, how might we scale this to a Melbourne setting, and what might work, what might have to change. I think it actually was for me, it was just personally an incredibly interesting and enriching experience. But I think it was also very good for the university because, they would look at these huge campaigns in the US that, because of course everyone would say, well, look at what Harvard's doing, or why aren't we raising money like Stanford? And, that was just so overwhelming, I think, for these big public institutions that had long history, very distinguished public, they were public universities and didn't have that spirit of alumni giving that, of course, is just endemic in the United States, and particularly at elite institutions. So I think it actually worked out really well for the university, and they've just completed a massive campaign, which I was believe campaign at the University of Melbourne, and I can't claim any credit for it, but I know a lot of the work that I did initially in terms of helping them set up their office, and not set up their office, they already had an office, but it really needed to be revisited and revised and actually recapitalized in terms of infrastructure and staffing, but I think it had been floundering for a while just because there wasn't a lot of investment, and there was a lot of skepticism at the university about fundraising. So when I first arrived, I can still remember clear as day. I'd been there about a week. A very kind colleague from the vice chancellor's office, who was a very senior academic, invited me to lunch, and we were chatting about things. And he said, "Well, really glad you're here. Happy you've come, but you have no chance of being remotely successful in this job because nobody in Australia will give money to higher education. Nobody cares." And, in the nicest possible way, like basically it's huge. And it was, and I was, of course, a little taken aback, a bit overwhelmed and a bit horrified, and said, well, I've moved my life to be here in Australia, and this is my, I'm a tenacious person, and I'm going to do what I can. And, then he actually gave me some very good advice, which I have always remembered and I have shared with other people who work in higher education. And it was basically, you need to find, there are 10 people in this university who are really influential. And some of them are obvious, like you could, the chair of the academic board, the chancellor of the university, and others. But then he took me through other people that wouldn't have been obvious to me, that they actually had a lot of moral authority, and that they were really highly trusted by their peers, staff and faculty. He said, I think if you can get in front of these 10 people and think of them as being a bit of a cabinet for you, like a bit of a kitchen cabinet, mm-hmm. That's the only way you have any chance of making a difference. And so that was in week, I don't know, it was like day 5. So I, went out and started meeting with these 10 people, and sure enough, really was wise advice. And, I think that a lot of the work that I did was around changing the culture at the university and getting particularly the academic leadership and the senior principal, who was basically the chief administrative officer, to actually realize that, they spent money on all kinds of other functions for outcomes. But yet when it came to development, or, at that time it was called university development, if it didn't just magically come in, it was doomed to fail. And so they starved it, and it didn't have the proper people. It didn't have proper budgets. And then it was a self-fulfilling prophecy. So that was a fascinating time. I really enjoyed it. I had a great time just living in Australia and traveled a lot. Got to see, it's an incredible country. It's a long way. It's a long way from many other places, most other places. That's why Australians are such great travelers. The ones that you see pre-COVID who would be on the road, they go on these massive trips and they're away for weeks, if not months at a time, because they value their time off, but also it just takes them so long to get anywhere. So when case came calling. That was kind of an appealing time to move to Singapore.
And I do want to ask you about that.
Yeah.
But before we go on to that, I'm so glad you told this story, because the way you described it, it's so often what I've heard too over the years. One thing is it won't work here. Fundraising won't work. But then when you dig a little deeper, what the real concern is, they don't think that people will give. You talked through that right there, that of course they do. And you can speak to it about how generous people are in Australia and certainly in Canada and in Hong Kong. In each of these environments, people are extraordinarily generous, but they do. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but in my impression is they need to be invited. So that's why developments or fundraising is so important.
No, absolutely. And, Jay, the other interesting thing, particularly about Melbourne University was, as I said, I'd studied history and love history. And so I did a bit of research on the foundation, the founding of the University of Melbourne. And it's, really incredible 150 years, I think, at the point when I was there. And of course, what I found out, and you will love this given your background, these amazing stories of philanthropists who had made the founding of the university really possible, right? Like it sense that, only Americans give to higher education. This is not part of our story. If you actually go back, it's very much part of their story. And the University of Melbourne is the university it is today because of many of those early benefactors who have a university in Melbourne, but also to open it up to others. And, there's some incredible stories of gifts that had come in many, like decades before. So it wasn't an alien thing. The second thing I think that helped in terms of changing the culture is I also came to realize that it wasn't just skepticism. It was also a lot of fear. Because I think a number of the academics, and again, this is like probably certainly one of the top 3 universities in Australia and one of the best in the world. But, many of these academics are not used to feeling uncomfortable in administrative space or, outside of their, once they start to get into this area where they feel a little, like it's something they haven't done before. They maybe think they're going to do it badly, or they're going to be embarrassed, or it's that whole kind of begging bowl. Now, I think that has changed really, like that culture shift has changed dramatically, but that was still very much part of the, I think the mindset then that, I'm going to look like an idiot if I go out asking for it. It's somehow not what I should be doing, and I'm uncomfortable doing it. Right. So one of the things that we did, and, and this was with the absolute endorsement and leadership of the Vice Chancellor, Professor Glenn Davis, who was a remarkable man to work with, a wonderful administrative leader and a great leader in Australia. And he's now running a big foundation in Australia. But so he's really now totally converted. He's working in philanthropy full time. But one of the things that we did is we actually started a kind of breakfast roundtable for academics to hear from their peers who were engaged in this kind of work. So one of the first people we brought in, we found out that the Dean of Engineering at Berkeley, at University of California, Berkeley, was an Australian who was graduate of the University of Melbourne, who was one of the top deans at Berkeley in terms of fundraising. And he was back home. He was Richard Newton, unfortunately passed away a number of years ago, but he was a remarkable person, and he agreed to come and talk to them. And so we had this great, very candid conversation where he talked about what he did as dean and his role as the academic lead, and why he was passionate about advocating for his students and his colleagues and their research programs and scholarships and all kinds of things, and what the role of the staff was, and what he spent on fundraising and the return on investment. And I could almost see the light bulbs going off around the table, and they really would listen to him because, of course, he had that credibility as a peer to sort of share what he was doing. And, he was very, as most Australians are, he was very direct. He was very candid. And we talked about the good, the bad, and the ugly. But the message was, I have learned how to do this. I'm properly supported to do it. I invest in it. I invest my time, but I also invest resources. And the return has been phenomenal. And we're now able to do so many more things because we have this private support that wouldn't have been possible just on the public and, intuition. So things like that, I think, were kind of falling into place at the right time. But that really did, I think, shifted the mindset quite dramatically from when I first arrived, where it was sort of a little bit of this, like I said, what's the kind of magic secret sauce that works? Tell us, and then, that'll be it. Like, they had to do the work themselves, and they did. And, the results are, of course, speaking for themselves, all these years later.
Well, and of course, they recognized, I guess, the value in this, at least some did. And that's exactly why you came in the first place. Then for Case to talk to you and for you to decide to leave Melbourne must have been something, because you were already, I know, enjoying this work immensely, and it was having the success. I'm imagining what it must have been like to make a decision to go and do this work in throughout the rest of Asia, in places where maybe they were not there yet. They were starting to think about what is the role of philanthropy to not just education, but all throughout, civil society, and will people give, and to what? And you had to build all these networks again. So how did this come about that you decided to take that role, and what was the mandate for that?
Wow. Well, again, just timing and obviously people. I had been a long time member of CASE and a huge fan of CASE and its the many wonderful things that CASE made possible for me in terms of training and development and network, and just building confidence as a kind of early career fundraising alumni relations professional. So I just was a member of the CASE tribe, as we like to say. And I think also, when Joanna Motion, who of course you will know, Jay, and Joanna is a remarkable person, just an amazing human, and had, I think, been such a passionate advocate for CASE, looking outside of the United States, and I guess Canada to a lesser degree, and to becoming, much more of an international organization, and not just exporting what worked in Virginia or Michigan to, Malaysia or Vietnam, but actually thinking about what can we take that works, but really make it culturally, we'll do it incrementally. It's not going to be this kind of massive rollout. It's going to have to grow organically. And there was a very solid business plan in place that Joanna and her colleagues done with a lot of care. And also John Lippincott, who was the president of CASE at the time, was a huge advocate for this. And I want to say, for both John and Joanna, in hindsight, of course, it was absolutely the right thing to do for CASE. And it's worked out to be, I think, a huge for the CASE organization as a whole. But none of those things were given at the time. And it took an enormous amount of, I think, moral courage to do that. And they had worked, I think, really carefully with the board of CASE, because obviously the board of CASE is responsible for making sure that the strategic plan and is, something that's sustainable for the organization, that's going to be prudent for all of the members. John and Joanna really, like I said, and Julian Bivens, who was the chair of the board at that time from the University of Virginia, a wonderful man. They really, like I said, had thoughtfully come up with a plan, wanted to invest in people, and knew that the membership would follow, but that the key thing was to get the right people in place. And I do think having that experience in Hong Kong, I had, worked as a bit of a solo shop, but also someone supporting a much bigger team and figuring out how to work really collaboratively with colleagues who are working virtually and way before anybody else was. So I was confident that I had the right skill set as in terms of my working experience. I should say as well that I think that Singapore was the right place to do the launch and to sort of establish the office there, because Singapore is just sort of situated in this amazing, the crossroads of the world, but you do have the infrastructure there. The Singapore government had decided that they were going to really put an emphasis on attracting like international nonprofit organizations. They have these different strategies and hubs and education. And, so again, the timing was very good. And I was just so excited at the chance to basically be part of building that international case presence in Asia Pacific and to be helpful to colleagues. I really enjoy professional development and kind of doing seminars and, speaking at different conferences. So I thought, wow, this is going to be something that's very hard to pass up, given the sort of historic nature of it. And also too, Singapore, as I said, is it appealed to me to kind of be based there because I loved, going through Singapore. It's an amazingly efficient place to be. It's, it allows you to see lots of different parts of, you're so close to many interesting countries, right? Within, an excellent airport. Love Changi Airport. I miss Changi Airport. So, it just sort of seemed to me like, it was like, how could I not do it when I had this opportunity? And when I talk about being a solo shop operator, wow, I was a solo shop operator as we had amazing support from the team at the National University of Singapore and US, right, who had agreed to sort of co-host the space and gave us a really phenomenal deal in terms of, like the actual space and also just being very good and helpful colleagues. But a lot of it was just figuring out all kinds of nuts and bolts, membership organization, implementation. So, for example, and you probably get a kick out of this, Jay, like one of the things was, how do you take the case database, and you're dealing with a lot of, Chinese names where the surname comes first. And how do you, I just remember these, amazed, like, how are we going to get this? How are we going to get this all figured out? Because that's internationalization, right? At the front pointy end, right? Is figuring out how to do that. And, so it was a lot of fun rolling up our sleeves. We did a big road show. We had, visitors coming through, the visitors in the office, which was fantastic. Like we'd have people, so I'd get to meet people coming into Singapore. But of course, I was also out on the road a lot of the time. And I love travel. I miss it. Hopefully we'll at some point be able to get back to doing a bit more of it. But it was a huge amount of travel. It was a lot of travel. So
it was also during a period I know where there was not just growth for Case with you and Joanna and others, but for all those organizations, all those universities and many other kinds of civil society organizations throughout the region. Very different sort of era. What was it like to be in the middle of all that as they're discovering the power of philanthropy to their own organizations?
Well, I should say, I think on the one hand, like Singapore is a bit of an outlier because Singapore is just like I said, when they decide they're going to do something, they invest in training, they're very organized. And so there were a number of opportunities to meet other people from the sector who were also setting up organizations in Singapore or going out to visit like the development teams, which were, just exploding in terms of size at the Singapore University. So we were all kind of riding a wave. Again, just I think really helping each other and sort of supporting one another. There were different secretariat operations that were there that, we would often just informally share ideas about how to get things done. So Singapore was the easy part. I think the really challenging, but in some respects even more interesting, was going to a lot of these universities that had never done any kind of fun, going to Thailand, visiting, universities there where it was literally, they were inventing the language because they didn't have words in Thai to describe what we were doing. I had the chance to go an incredible trip to Xi'an in China, the home of the terracotta warriors. Mm-hmm. And, there was a conference there for Association of Chinese Universities. And again, same thing, like doing presentations where it was being simultaneously translated and, figuring out, well, how do you actually say this in Chinese? How do you describe it? How do you give examples that are going to resonate for that audience? And of course, now this would have been at very early in the journey. And now many Chinese universities are doing exceptional work running their own programs, but it was very much at the very early stages. And I think rightly so. People were figuring out what they could take from a Western model and modify and, adapt or completely change for their own culturally appropriate environment. But it was a fascinating time. And I met some really incredible people and really enjoyed it. Had the chance to go to Japan a number of times, which was, of course, something you and I have a shared love for Japan. And, again, just navigating some really interesting conversations about how this might work in a totally different place. And there was the kind of appetite for knowledge, the openness to thinking about how they might do things differently, was really pretty incredible. Very few roadblocks. Like there were the occasional, like I said, very skeptical people who were like, this is never going to work here. But for the most part, people were like, we got to figure this out. And, we're not going to be left behind. And we can kind of see that what's possible with philanthropy and with having much more engaged alumni and other kinds of stakeholders, that's really for the benefit of our institutions. And so, we're going to figure it out, and it's not going to be perfect. It's going to be maybe a bit messy, but we are going to figure it out. And they did.
And I know there's so much to unpack there that we could talk about it for hours, but I know there was a sliver of time in a way because you kept moving. So you were on then to the Rhodes Trust, I think it was, right? And so where were you based for that?
Well, I was basically invited to come and set up a global advancement program for the Rhodes Scholarships. And that's hard to say no to. So I packed up and sent my container my shipping container, I should say, to Oxford. So I moved from Singapore to Oxford. And Rhodes Trust is a UK charity. They have a slightly unusual status within. They're kind of considered part of the University of Oxford, but they have their own independent charitable status. And of course, they don't offer any programs. They just have this amazing group of scholars that come through every year and are, a truly extraordinary alumni group for the University of Oxford. So we are, I would say the Rhodes Trust is sort of in and of Oxford, but not actually part of the University of Oxford. And
so I think it's fair to say also that for those who don't know, that Oxford wasn't always a fundraising powerhouse either. They went through a period where they were also making decisions about whether to commit to this, and some of those were complicated decisions about where to accept gifts from and what they were willing to name, if anything. But of course, they've raised a tremendous amount of money after opening doors and answering some of those questions. And so it wasn't a given that people would just be able to raise a lot of money for Oxford and Cambridge, et cetera.
No, well, absolutely. I think, again, leadership is so important. The investment is so important in terms of, saying we are going to plant our flag and do this. And it's going to take time. It's going to take a lot of energy. And of course, they do have an incredible story to tell, and they have an amazing reach in terms of their alumni and their visibility. But it's a really interesting thing, I think, for, Oxbridge, because they have many of these built-in advantages of just the history and the legacy, but they also have, I think, to overcome to some degree people who are, well, they're such wealthy institutions. Why would I give to them? Because they already are so well endowed, which they are compared to some other institutions in the UK. So again, it's about making that really fresh case for support. And, the Oxford Thinking Campaign, which was run, it was initiated by my old boss, John Delandria. It's a small world because it went from John's stewardship to Sue Cunningham, who's now the president of CASE, and then on to Liesl Elder, who was the director for most of the time when I was there. They basically made it very much about, we need to be relevant for the 21st century. And we can't be just, resting on our laurels for, the remarkable people who've come through here over the, hundreds of years that we've been established. And, I would say the same thing for the Rhodes scholarships, because again, relatively well endowed in terms of the, and problematic in terms of where the money originally came from. But this was the world's first international scholarship program, and it had funded, I think, nearly 4,500 people. It had funded way more than that. There were about 4,500 living Rhodes scholars when I started in the job, and they were from, they lived, of course, all over the world. And the whole thing there was, how do we reframe what we do for the next century? So it was the whole second century campaign. What does it mean to be a Rhodes Scholar, and how do you modernize and really make it relevant? And with that focus on leadership and service. And also, there was some pretty urgent need to raise the money, because there were, very pressing financial pressures on the endowment just coming out of the global financial crisis, and the cost of, educating international students at Oxford was escalating dramatically. There were some pretty significant imperatives to actually really hit the ground running. And that was, again, just a fascinating opportunity, because you had this remarkable group of people that had been through the Rhodes program and had studied at Oxford. And that was a transformative experience for them. And they're, proud of their time as a Rhodes Scholar. They had never been asked to give money to the Rhodes Trust. And indeed, many of them, when they were students, the Rhodes Trust would have been the kind of golden goose. They had a lot of money, and they were funding many other things within Oxford. So again, culture shift. How do you start to actually say, this has got to be a collective responsibility, or it's not going to look the same in 10 years. It's not going to be the leading scholarship program if we don't come together to really make this stronger, and not just give money, but actually invest our time and our energy in reimagining what the Rhodes Scholarship is going to be for, coming generations.
I wonder how it was when you reached out to them and you invited them to participate for the first time. How did they react? Were they happy? Were they saying, what took you so long? What kind of reaction did you get?
Well, it was sort of, I got to say, there was, of course, no uniform response,
Sure.
But I will say that very few people were disinterested. There was a high degree of interest, and of course, some very, as you can imagine, that's an interesting group of people to be working with, because there are some of the very, highly engaged, very successful in different industries and different institutions and political life, and running big university presidents, this sort of thing. A lot of university people who were actually saying, I feel a sense of responsibility, and how I'm going to be part of this community varied. But very few people said, I have no interest in this. Some of them were more skeptical than others. Like, what's the financial case? What happened? Like, basically, what happened to change the financial position from one of plenty to scarcity? I think it was really fundamentally about engaging them in deep conversation. There was quite a remarkable process that was run by the warden of Rhodes House. His name was Donald Markwell, and he's actually the person who recruited me to the job. And, Don did quite a remarkable thing, working closely with the trustees and with other colleagues, where they went out and they called it the Rhodes Strategic Dialogue. And I believe there were 8 or 9 questions, not a huge laundry list, but really good strategic questions about what the future looks like for the scholarship. And I think Don went to every single Rhodes constituency, because at that time the scholarships were allocated to particular countries. They still are, but they also have now more like at-large scholarships that are open to students from any country. But at that time, because this is all basically through the will of Cecil Rhodes, saying, there's a scholarship for Bermuda. There are 3 scholarships for Germany, or I think there were 2 scholarships for Germany, but they were sort of very defined where they came from. So Don did this, like I said, led this process where he went, and they had, I think every Rhodes Scholar basically got an invitation to come to one of these sessions, and a remarkably high number of them actually went and, had the chance to have their say. And Don would use that feedback. Now, again, he wasn't directly responding to every single suggestion that came up because that would be overwhelming, but looking at what are the general themes that we're seeing, and right across the community, what are we hearing from people? And that's what's going to drive the fundraising strategy, is actually looking at what's necessary, what we need to do as an organization. And then we're going to focus on participation. Obviously, that's a kind of a key thing. And many of the Rhodes Scholars, particularly in the United States, which is, I think, about half of them live in the US, they were already being actively solicited for gifts to support the Association of American Rhodes Scholars. So there was an organization within the US that did some fundraising for that group, and also for their colleges, their home colleges at Oxford. So it's not that they'd never been asked. They just had never been asked to actually give money to the scholarship itself.
Right.
So participation was a big thing, focusing on, going to each of the classes, because they come to Oxford as a group. Many of them kind of bond with their classmates in that cohort. So trying to focus on getting just participation up. We had I think a really successful planned giving push to kind of say, we're going to create a Rhodes Society, and you've benefited from this enormous legacy. And that would be a wonderful thing, because, as you know, planned giving legacies are just, I think, a phenomenal thing over time to always be thinking about. And then, of course, the vast majority of the money came from a small number of highly successful people that just had the capacity to make very large gifts, including, I think it was the single largest gift in the UK in 2012, which was a gift from John and Marcy McCall-McBain of £75 million, which we were able to announce at the Rhodes 110th anniversary celebrations, which was in 2013. And so that was by far the biggest gift ever to a scholarship program at that time in the United Kingdom. And it really, I think, sent out an enormous vote of confidence in the future of the scholarships. And, John and his wife, Marcy, and their foundation have been just incredible people to work with, and have gone on to fund other programs. They set up a $200 million McCall-McBain Scholars Program at McGill, which runs through the 200th anniversary of McGill University. So, it's just great to sort of see that continuing to grow. But really, it was, John and Marcy who, really huge lift to that campaign for the second century. And then there were a number of other really extraordinarily generous, like Julian Robertson from Tides Management gave £7.5 million to basically capitalize the Rhodes Scholarships for New Zealand. And, people were doing this with not getting their name. It didn't suddenly become the Robertson Rhodes Scholarship. They, for that size of a gift, you would normally be expecting, almost a rebrand of the scholarship. But people were, really very gracious in agreeing that the Rhodes name would continue to be primary.
I wanted to ask you about a couple of things in there. One is that if you had Cecil Rhodes' testament, which was said this is the way the money was to be distributed according to which country and how much money, but by raising money, you not only made it possible to continue doing the work, but you also probably made it possible to fund scholarships that you would not have funded under that state. So important. And it brings up another question, without getting into the politics of it. Many people have debated this whole thing about our relationships with donors the last few years. And you just addressed part of it by saying this wasn't, in the case of Julian Robertson, for example, it wasn't about putting the name on the scholarship. It was about supporting the work. That's not true for every donor, but it's certainly true for many. So one of the questions that I have, as you went through this process and then later again returned to the University of Toronto, is how much of this is a matter of providing the right kind of opportunities so that people can really be our partners, rather than feeling like they're either being used as piggy banks, as one philanthropist has recently said, or conversely, that we have to make some sort of, pledge to do whatever they want. It seems like those are the two fears in our sector. And right there, with one of the world's oldest and most profound scholarship programs, you didn't do either of those things.
And I think that was the right thing for the organization. And I think that the reason that the Rhodes Trust was able to do that, partly, of course, was the Rhodes name. People know it. It's almost a given what it sort of signifies. So there's lots of reasons why you would want to be associated with that. And just the track record in terms of the extraordinary people that have been supported over many generations, I think also just adds to that reputation and sense of affiliation being important. But I think the second thing is that the Rhodes trustees, the board, who were remarkable and personally very generous, not only with their money, but also even more critically with their counsel and their expertise, they are highly principled individuals, and they were prepared to put in the time and to really carefully discuss with the donors why they were giving to the scholarships and what it made possible, and why, it was important to kind of stick to the aspirations of the scholarship program, which was really about, leaders for the world's future. Mm-hmm. And, the investment in these young people, and that why giving, for example, to the campaign would allow the Rhodes Trust to offer more scholarships to students from Africa, which, I think, again, is just a phenomenal thing to be able to say that now, there are Rhodes Scholars coming from Ghana, from Kenya, from Nigeria, from all kinds of places that previously weren't at the table. I think it was from a point of principle. I do, again, I won't undersell the position of, you've kind of got something that's already really established, right? You have something that's got a real proof of concept over generations, but you also have to overcome, some people would say, like, where does this money come from? It comes from the very problematic legacy of Cecil Rhodes and how that money was made, because it was basically his estate when he died. And that was on the backs of many, many millions of Black Africans in South Africa, what we call South Africa, and of course, Rhodesia, which was named after Cecil Rhodes, which is Zambia and Zimbabwe, and many other countries nearby. So, I think that kind of reconciliation piece and trying to actually be very open about the legacy of where this money came from, but what it has made possible and what it can make possible with, partnerships and new donors. It
sounds like something that you were very aware of. And I mean, that's in your nature to be sensitive to those issues, but it's also something that our whole sector has been talking more about, finally, everywhere in the world. How do we make sense of the history we've inherited? How do we make a better future? Where do donors and the work of fundraising fit into that? That was even true, I guess, at the University of Toronto. So maybe not to the same degree as with the Rhodes, but University of Toronto is such a major institution, serves so many people who are from Canada, but not just Ontario, and so many people from throughout the world as a leading institution. I know that even there have been thoughts about, where does the money come from? What is it that we want to do in the world next? And you returned there, I'm sure, with many things in mind. So what, first of all, when did you go back and why did you return? Was it to work on that campaign of your school again, or what was that about? And then how do those issues then play into the work that you did?
Well, Shay, I think, to be honest with you, some of it is just coming full circle. And I, had lived away for a long time. And I felt that at some point I had always seen myself being back in Canada eventually. It was just a question of when. I remember, making up lists with kind of pros and cons. And I thought, if I wait until I'm much older, it's going to be that much harder to go back because you can never really entirely go home, right? Things have moved on. If you've left, I basically left when I was, 21, 22 years old to work overseas. And even though I've been back on a, very regular basis for work and for family and friends and other reasons, it's kind of hard to go back. So I thought every year I wait, it's going to get harder and harder. It's just harder to kind of reestablish your life. So it was the right time back. And I had an incredible opportunity to work leading the campaign for the Faculty of Arts and Science within the University of Toronto, which is the downtown campus. And for people who know Toronto, it's the St. George campus. And today is St. George's Day, by the way. So that's kind of nice. Today is St. George's Day. It's a public holiday here in Newfoundland. That's another funny thing. Anyway, but it was the right time to be back. And arts and science is an enormously complex and fascinating division. I think it's the largest faculty in North America.
How many faculty there? Is it 2,000 people or what?
There are 1,000 academic professors. I think it's close to 30,000 students. It would be bigger than most universities in Canada. I think on its own, it would be the fourth biggest university, just that one faculty. And just the range of things that happen within that was my home faculty. But, everything from, my joke used to be, it was everything from, astronomy to Zoroastrianism. And that was a project that I worked on, Zoroastrians. And as someone pointed out, one of my dear colleagues who I just loved, who was a professor of Islamic studies, but he said the Zoroastrians, of course, were the ones who figured out astronomy. So anything from astronomy to Zoroastrians and then Zoroastrian astronomy. Anyway, it's across sciences and the humanities. And I was, and of course there was a massive Boundless campaign, the biggest in the history of Canada and one of the biggest campaigns in North America.
How much was that? Was that $2 billion or what was that?
It was, I think it landed in the end at $2.4 billion when it was wound up in 2019. Mm-hmm. And so just to, and again, it was one of these 10 years. It was a very comprehensive campaign. And I, had the chance to work with an incredible dean. His name is Professor David Cameron. He is not the former Prime Minister of the UK. He's saying to me, "You worked for David Cameron," and he's a political scientist. He's a very distinguished political scientist. So I worked really closely with David and some extraordinary academic leaders across. I think there were 31 different departments within arts and science. So juggling a lot of plates. We had some really interesting campaigns that we ran during my time there. Including, support for Iranian studies, which has been a really interesting and exciting field to see supported. There's some really, really significant new initiatives that have been funded coming out of that Boundless campaign. Also some, very cool things around computer science, mathematics. I had the chance to work with some really extraordinary people and obviously stewarding some very large gifts that had come in before I got there. But in total, I was going to say I was there for, I guess it would be in total, I was there for nearly 7 years, working primarily in advancement. Then I was also doing some community outreach and strategic partnerships work last couple of years that I was there at the university. So, and now I'm doing something totally different. So
that's what I understand. And it's also timely work because we've all been one way or another trying to contend emotionally anyway, as well as physically with the pandemic. And I guess you must be kind of at the heart of thinking about what that means in terms of relating to all the people who support your work. Tell us a bit about that. What are you doing today?
Well, I have left the hallowed halls of higher education for a great nonprofit organization called the Canadian Mental Health Association, CMHA. CMHA, I'm with a national organization. So it's a federation across the country. It's a really remarkable group of people that are totally about supporting people with mental health challenges and promoting kind of mental wellness, and a group of people that this is interesting because tomorrow is the birthday of CMHA's founding. It started on April 26th, 1918. Their first meeting was at the Chateau Laurier Hotel in Ottawa. And this was a leading group of people who wanted to, destigmatize mental health because, of course, like many places, people who had mental health challenges were often incredibly isolated or, vilified, frankly, and, pretty poorly treated or basically out of sight, out of mind. So this was a collective group. It's a lay group of people. It's always been committed to kind of grassroots community provision of services. There are, I think, about 8,000 people across the country who work for CMHA. It's an enormous, coast to coast to coast organization. And I'm working as a strategic advisor to the CEO, Margaret. She's a really dynamic, amazing person who started with CMHA as the national CEO, I think like a few weeks before the pandemic started. So Margaret has been able to steward CMHA through just extraordinary times. And I guess in a really positive way, there's been support for mental health and groups like CMHA in an unprecedented way because of the pandemic. People, I guess, are a lot more vocal now than they were previously. The research is there. I think just collective experience would certainly indicate that we are all in our own way navigating such difficult and interesting and, challenging times. We like to say kind of our time is now. This is the time. And our big push is around universal access to mental health services and to really kind of change the conversation. So it's not just about, in Canada, about 1 in 5 people have a mental health challenge or, mental illness at any one time. 5 out of 5 have mental health, and all of us need to be mindful of we're going through, showing up for other people. Next week, we're launching our mental health week, and the emphasis this year, like we have a theme every year, and it's all about empathy and, the importance of just showing up for people and, not necessarily weighing in with a solution to everything, but actually just listening and being there for one another. So yeah, it's early days. This is sort of month 2 for me with the CMHA. So I can't with any kind of authority really speak about it, just to say I'm blown away by the caliber of colleagues that I have and the enormous reach of CMHA. And I think, it's a terrific organization, and I'm just learning about this new sector and, trying to think in my own way what I can do to help in terms of the sort of fund development and, thinking about partnerships and philanthropy for this group, which, I think is needed more than ever. So
absolutely.
Absolutely. A great time.
Krista, you got to the word that is one of my favorite words, which is empathy. And we hadn't talked about that before under that word, but it does seem to be something that I'm sure was a central point for all the different things that you've done professionally. I'm sure personally as well throughout this career you've been describing, because you were working in all these different environments with different languages, different cultures, different histories, different everything, let alone a different fundraising practice and philanthropy practices. So people have to sort of feel one another and be in another person's shoes in order to do that work. Empathy is a huge part of the work we do. And I wonder, this is a question I often ask people, if we can hold on to that as we move, hopefully, into a healthier time post-pandemic. I know I don't think we're there, obviously, but when we get there, the issues you've been talking about, how optimistic are you that we can get people to continue, focusing on things like mental wellness and listen to others?
Hey, I'm always a glass half full person, and I actually am feeling, even though we are like just living through extremely uncertain times, I actually think that awareness about what each of us are experiencing, and that sense of, and again, not to be naive about it, it's not, kind of kumbaya, we're all in this together. I think we've seen that we've all experienced the pandemic very differently based on our position of privilege or, things that we have kind of in our corner. But I do think this focus on being empathetic as much as we can, listening to where other people are coming from and being open to those kind of conversations and asking questions, not trying to sort everything out, but asking questions and genuinely listening. I actually am optimistic that we're moving into a better place when it comes to these things. And, I think there's probably going to be a few bends and interesting get thrown at us in terms of curveballs. But I do think this awareness of what makes for a good life, what makes for quality and connection with other people, I think that has been fundamentally upended by the pandemic. And I actually see it as something to be optimistic about, that we are going to see their work-life balance is changing. I think that employers are having to be a lot more flexible and for good reason. And that's not out of an altruistic position, but it's actually better for the organization to be more flexible and to let people kind of create what works better for them and for their families, can still be very good for the organization. So I am optimistic, and you found me on a good day, because there have been days when it's just been like, oh, what's coming next between, what the absolute, unspeakable things that are happening in Ukraine and, this crazy convoy trucker situation that we had here in Canada. Like, it's just, we have been, a lot has been asked of us, but we're still here. And I think we just have to do everything we can to show up for one another. And, like I said, I do think empathy is something that can be cultivated. I remember going to a really interesting talk pre-pandemic, business school at U of T. And there was a wonderful professor from Stanford named Jamil Nakvi, I think. And he had written a book about empathy and sort of the science of empathy, and that you can, and I'll double check his surname. That's, I should remember, but Jamil Nakvi, I think is his name. But it was basically how, you can actually cultivate empathy. It's not something that you're just innately born with. Some people are. I think some people just have a natural tendency to be curious about other people. But it is something that, with intention, you can actually cultivate in the way you can, mindfulness or other sorts of practices. So I'm all for cultivating more empathy and spreading the gospel of empathy, because I think we need it more than ever. And I certainly see it as something for me, like that's one of my highest values as a good colleague, is curious and empathetic, because I think that's where a lot of the best work actually happens, from being curious about people and having that. And again, kind of coming full circle, I mentioned to you when we first started chatting about this, ancestor of mine who had, navigated the world as a captain of a schooner. Think about, these amazing stories of, he was shipwrecked in Madeira for a year and just unbelievable stuff. And, and you kind of think, but he always kind of came back, and he was a great explorer, but he always came home. And so I think, for me, I sort of feel like I've kind of come home, and I'm really enjoying this journey with CMHA, because it's the empathy, showing up for other people, being curious about the world. That for me has led to a really rewarding career. And I love working in philanthropy and partnerships. I think the kind of work we do is truly a gift. So I'm continue to be optimistic.
The Philanthropy Masterminds podcast is underwritten by DonorSearch, the world leader in donor intelligence solutions. Our producer is Jack Frost. Our theme music is Be My Remedy, composed and performed by House of Say. You can subscribe to the Philanthropy Masterminds podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find blogs, webcasts, and CFRE accredited webinars with our featured masterminds at DonorSearch.net, or check the show notes and descriptions.